The Grenlec Debates, powering bright ideas.
You're watching the 10th season of the Grenlec Debates. Please bear in mind that matches, topics, and positions are randomly selected by schools. The theme for the round of 16 is development. I am your chairperson, Eric Williams, and I call this house to order. The motion: be it resolved that Grenada can continue to develop without full implementation of a land use policy. Proposition: Bishop's College. Opposition: St. Joseph's Convent, St. George's. Please welcome the first speaker for the proposition.
Is development a tunnel vision view of what we see when we look outside our windows? The bricks and buildings or roads? Is it limited to the size of our economy? Is it perhaps our GDP growth? Any such myopic implication or advancement is what forms the basis of my team's uncompromising support of today's moot. Be it resolved that Grenada can continue to develop without full implementation of a land use policy. Good afternoon. I would define key terms and lay the foundation of our case. Our second speaker would demonstrably highlight how development can continue even when the land use policy is absent, partially implemented, or even half implemented. The Cambridge Dictionary defines develop as, and I quote, to cause something to grow or change into a more advanced, larger, or stronger form, end of quote. Furthermore, Michael Tadao, in the text Economics for a Developing World, defines development as, and I quote, a multidimensional process involving changes in structures, attitudes, as well as institutions, and the acceleration of economic growth, the reduction of inequality, and the eradication of absolute poverty, end of quote. Development, therefore, is dynamically complex and multifaceted. Economist Nazim Bok, September 2017, concurs. A policy, as defined by the Business Dictionary, is a set of principles that will guide decision-making in relation to any particular phenomena. In this case, lands, and establishes how limited land space is utilized to its fullest potential, while encompasses issues related to the use of land, protection of land, as well as the concept of zoning. This brings me to the term full implementation, which through in-depth research, we have coined as the perfect or complete execution of a plan, decision, or policy. Esteemed judges, as I'm sure you're aware, perfection is a pretty elusive concept, and it defies logic that development being so all-encompassing, so dynamic, can discontinue even if the implementation of a land use policy is partial or even excellent but not full? Inconceivable. Do we not know that development speaks to the quality of healthcare, the quality of education, the overall quality of life of the citizens, along with all the other indices? When, as a society, we are now speaking about establishing a sex offenders registry compared to years ago when the silence on issues of this nature was deafening? Is this not development? So, if we don't have zoning, we will not continue to have development of this nature and scope? Honorable Chair, does Grenada even have a land use policy? Dr. Valman Jessamy, 2013, indicates that, and I quote, it is evident that there are a large body of instruments that inform land management. However, there is no single document that provides an articulation of a policy, end of quote. Worthy opponents, in the absence of these, have we not been developing as a nation? We have seen a 3.9% expansion in GDP, IMF 2017. For the year 2016, approximately 231 Grenadians have received scholarships to access university degrees, Budget Speech 2017. We have been able to attract the first major hotel development on Grenada's beach for more than 25 years, thereby adding to our room stock. So all of these will suddenly stop. We will suddenly stagnate, become frozen in time, because implementation of a land use policy is excellent but not full? Really? Hear this. Barbados has a land use policy cited as the Physical Development Plan amended 2003 and supported by the Town Planning Act. However, Bajans are up in arms over what they considered the blatant disregard for said pieces of legislation by the powers that be. In spite of this partial, dare I say non-implementation of its land use policy, today, Barbados is referred to as the Singapore of the Caribbean. It has a literacy rate of 98%, and according to the United Nations, joins countries the likes of Israel and Hong Kong on the list of developed countries based purely on the Human Development Index. Honorable judges, not because we're debating, must we ignore the potential value of a land use policy in dictating and allocating lands for specific purposes, especially so for Grenada, which has limited land space? We contend, however, that even when the implementation of any such policy is not complete, not comprehensive, development can continue. I thank you.
The first speaker for the opposition.
Honorable judges, audience, all, good afternoon. My team and I refute our opponent's definitions. We firmly oppose the resolution that Grenada can continue to develop without full implementation of a land use policy. I will outline what this land use policy will encompass and why it is necessary for our sustainable development. Our second speaker will demonstrate how the absence of a land use policy has been detrimental to Grenada's sustainable development. According to the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, or the UNCCD, land is the foundation of our societies and the engine of economic growth. We build our homes, grow our foods, and transport our goods on land. We even get our energy and filter our water from the land. Then opponents, why do we degrade it when it is so essential to our survival and holistic development? Land is linked to every aspect of our society and needs to be efficiently utilized. We can protect this asset in two simple ways: by protecting what we have left and fixing what we have destroyed. Full implementation of a national land use policy will facilitate this initiative. Grenada receives funding for this initiative from the OECS, European Union, and Australian government through the recent Paris Climate Change Agreement, as well as the Land Degradation Neutrality Project, executed with the support of the UNCCD Secretariat. So what is this land use policy we need to fully implement? According to Mr. Fabian Purcell, head of the Physical Planning Unit Grenada, a land use policy will state how land is to be utilized for various valuable aspects of society. It lays out the rules for sustainable development and ensures that the best value of land is obtained. It allocates land for housing, commercial, tourism, and industrial development. This policy will allow for the safeguarding of fertile land for agricultural use and environmental conservation. A national land use policy will provide the mandate and basis for a range of programs, measures, and actions aimed at improving and rationalizing land use and management in Grenada. These include, but are not limited to, conducting a comprehensive review of all land-related legislation and the improvement of the mechanisms for their enforcement. Moreover, a national land use agency will also be commissioned, and the capacity of key agencies responsible for land administration, management, and monitoring will be fortified. It will allow for the coordination and sharing of information and will improve public awareness and education on related matters. According to the OECS Projects on Sustainable Land Management and Climate Change Adaptation report, this policy will develop through consultations with multidisciplinary teams ranging from government agencies to civil society. Why do we need to implement it? According to the Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite-Martinique Land Policy Issue Paper, the importance of the country's land resources to economic growth and development, poverty reduction, and survival and well-being of the entire population is well known and cannot be overemphasized. Despite this knowledge, the sustainability of these resources is seriously threatened by various types of incompatible development activities, such as indiscriminate agricultural practices and ad hoc developments, which result in land degradation and contamination of our nation's resources. UN Global Conferences agrees that economic development must become sustainable by incorporating environmental and resource management for the benefit of future generations. Additionally, a national land use policy will help to fill in the gaps in the current legislation, some of which were never adopted. This would provide a legal instrument which controls land development and ensures protection. Honorable judges, we must discontinue the quasi-traditional approach in which land is perceived and rather fully implement a land use policy where land is a natural resource which, if mismanaged, will impede Grenada's development. I thank you.
The second speaker for the proposition.
When you want something, all the universe conspires in helping you achieve it, land use policy or not. One important aspect of the development process is the building of a human capacity. Institutions and infrastructures are important, but a skilled, educated workforce is required to carry out the basic functions such as policing, security, regulation, and core service delivery. And yes, even driving policy, the nature of which is under scrutiny today. For countries to reap these benefits fully, opponents, they need to unleash the potential of a human mind. And there is no better tool for doing so than education. But are you telling us that in order to develop or educate our human resource, that we need to have a fully implemented land use policy? That we need a land use policy to be able to send you and me to school? After all, we see that education is a passport to the future. And so if that's the case, doesn't a land use policy come as a consequence of empowering the people with the capacity to influence policies like these? This is not to say that one is better than the other, but having a land use policy is like a slice of a pie that would influence our development. But we have to take all the other slices that would give us development in totality. Judges, development is qualitative and not just quantitative, and is a process of social change, not merely a set of policies instituted for a specific purpose. Therefore, social development, which empowers people by creating more inclusive, cohesive, and accountable institutions and societies are also development, and is the type of development which would not terminate because we only have some degree of success in clearly demarcating areas of land in need of protection. We have seen men, honorable judges, men leading a march against child sexual abuse in our country. Then, we have the case of the Mac family of Simone receiving a home from the young leaders group of the St. Joseph's Convent, Grenville. Opponents inspiring young people, developing our social cells, putting people first, the very epitome of development. Opponents, healthcare is central to the well-being and is a necessary foundation for a satisfying and rewarding life. But tell me, how is the development of a land use policy contribute to precision? Save and except for hospital planning. It doesn't. Does it? And yes, even when we have problems plaguing our healthcare system, we have seen development taking place. And these are not one-off experiences. Just 2 weeks ago, according to the New Today, the European Union has disbursed 1.4 million euros to Grenada, the first tranche of grant assistance towards widening the range of primary healthcare services accessible at the community level. And further disbursement of this assistance are expected in 2019, according to UE Ambassador Daniela Tramaseri. Isn't this development? Would this kind of development end if, perchance, lands best used for housing are used for agriculture? Opponents, are you intimating that we should put all our eggs in one basket? When you say that a land use policy is going to stagnate or is suddenly going to stop development, are you not saying that where we are right now is where we are going to be 10, 15 years from now because we don't have a land use policy? That is just not logical. Certainly not practical. I thank you.
The second speaker for the opposition.
Good afternoon to all. I maintain my first speaker's definition. Land is a finite resource, and its preservation is essential for our sustainability. We therefore continue to state emphatically that Grenada cannot continue without fully implementing a land use policy. According to Mr. Edward Niles, National Policy's issue paper consultant, in the absence of a land use policy, many loopholes exist in our legislation, thus resulting in many land issues in Grenada. For example, under the National Parks Protected Areas Act, the head of state and other relevant authorities have the authority to declare an area a national park. At the same time, he or she, if politically influenced, also has the authority to change protected areas into management zones for economic gain. Clearly, this is a perfect example of the many loopholes that exist in our legislation. Moreover, no legal provisions exist for the civil society's participation in land management. Non-profit agencies, like the Willie Redhead Foundation, have no legal footing to provide meaningful input when government decides to target and tear down historical buildings. Just walk around St. George's. How does this benefit tourism and, by extension, national development? Furthermore, the Physical Planning and Development Act, in its current state, lacks the appropriate regulations that will ensure effective implementation. As a result, throughout Grenada, land has been severely misused. Honorable judges, Grenada's Land Degradation Neutrality National Report states that in Bellevue, South, Carriacou, about 20 years ago, the land was fertile, full of lush vegetation and animals grazing leisurely. Fast forward to 2017, the land is now barren and eroded due to overgrazing. The change is drastic, but it could have been avoided. A land use policy would establish rotating grazing periods to lessen the effects of overgrazing. If it is not fully implemented now, what will happen in the next few decades? Similar images of land degradation and soil fertility loss are evident across Grenada, impeding agriculture, food security, and the economy. Deforestation and uncontrolled mining of sand and gravel increase the vulnerability of ecosystems to erosion, natural hazards, habitat destruction, and loss of lives and livelihood. Honorable judges, these actions are horrendous. I ask, therefore, how can we continue to develop without these grave implications in this era of climate change? At present, there is no clearly formulated land use policy to guide the location and construction of buildings. Houses are being built on steep and unstable slopes, such as Dabo. Picture Grand Mall, the Sol gas plant is encircled by homes and the coast. If there were any accidents, the surrounding area will feel its effects. Worthy opponents, our health, livelihood, and environment are at risk. The time for us to take a stand is now. Without a doubt, the implementation of effective legislation, the promotion of our economic well-being, and the protection of our environment can only be guaranteed if we fully implement a land use policy. I thank you.
The opposition cross-examiner.
Worthy opponent, humor me. Close your eyes. Picture Telescope Beach, where aggregate mining has caused severe erosion, or Bellevue South, where overgrazing has degraded land. Is this the land we want to leave for future generations to develop?
Opponents, you talk about Bellevue South. Are you aware that there have been lands reserved by the local business people for agricultural purposes?
Despite their reservation, the Governor General can change them into management zones, and that is not the question at hand.
Opponents, again, back to Bellevue South. 20 years ago, we didn't have roads to access Harveyville. Now we have roads. Isn't that development?
Yes, it's development, but can it be sustained? Moving on with the opponent. According to the CDC, for total well-being of a people, green spaces are required for recreation and lessening of non-communicable diseases. Other than the already compromised Kamahan Park, are you aware of any other reserved areas for such? No?
Opponents, we are not saying that there should be any implementation of a land use policy, but of course we need a proper land use policy to make sure that these regulations are in place. But only that even when that
And if it's not fully implemented, then other loopholes in the
opponents, I'm not finished. But only that even when that implementation is not full, Grenada can continue to develop.
Can I move on, please? We plan for everything. Why then, with the opponent, do we not plan for future land use like other countries such as St. Lucia, Nigeria, UK, and each US state?
Opponents, we are talking about Grenada here. How did these...
Don't we all have land?
Yes,
The question is not if our country can sustain it. Our land use policy will be specially developed for us.
First of all, opponents, how development is not only quantitative but also qualitative.
I'm aware of that.
How is the land use policy even linked to the quality of medical services?
I just said that the CDC reported that it is responsible for the prevention of non-communicable diseases. Moving on with the opponent. Do you believe that our current land use activities ascribe to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are a reflection of our Grenadian Sustainable Development Plan?
Opponents, like I mentioned before, development is not only quantitative but also qualitative, and thereby you are restricting your meaning of the term development. Opponents, first of all, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word development?
It is the betterment of the livelihood of the people. And Mr. Trevor Thompson, head of land use division in the Ministry of Agriculture, said that we are not utilizing our land effectively.
Isn't development improving our literacy rate?
The proposition cross-examiner.
Opponents, your first speaker talked about discontinuing old practices in order to conserve our natural resources. Are you aware that each year a new and stronger pesticide is brought out, which does more harm to our environment?
Yes, I'm aware.
So how can you say that that we can continue to develop in that sort of sense?
Can you rephrase, please?
Opponents, I am asking, how can you continue to develop when we have these pesticides harming our natural resources?
Whether or not our pesticides develop, there are still traditional methods such as the legal practice that has severely degraded your own Bellevue South, as well as the pesticides coming in. No matter how you practice your agriculture, there is a way in which the land will be damaged.
Opponents, this is the 21st century. Haven't you heard about other alternatives that we can use? Hydroponics, growing soil in a soilless medium. Opponents, local, a proto-mini type indoor farm, which uses hydroponics and LEDs. It has been proven to roughly grow trees.
And they do not damage the land at all?
No, they do not damage the land because in the first place, they are not even using the land.
And are they practiced in Grenada?
Opponents, not because they are not practiced in Grenada, means that we can utilize it. All these are forms of development.
We can continue to develop if we have a proper usage of our land. And if hydroponics is part of that, then it will help us develop our land.
Thank you, opponents. Thank you. Currently, isn't Grenada already developing without any land use policy?
Yes, but it will come to a standstill without it.
But opponents, isn't the literacy rate of our education development, isn't being able to now put over 20 secondary schools in Grenada development, isn't being able to now offer MRI scans and all sorts of medical services to our country development?
All of this will come to a stop with the opponent.
Come to a stop.
The land
Opponents come to a
every
stop. So how is the
sector.
land use policy going to help this?
Land affects every single sector of our Grenadian economy.
How so?
All right, in terms of tourism, if you build hotels in unsuitable areas, they can be damaged quite easily.
Opponents, even in the absence of a land use policy, have we seen people making such gulf decisions?
And wouldn't a policy facilitate for continued development?
But opponents, there is where we come into our standing in mood. Like I said before, there must be some form of implementation to control it. But even when it is not full, we can still continue to develop.
Without full implementations, there will only arise loopholes.
Thank you. Opponents. Let us say we legislated land use policy and it has an implementation rate of 90%. Will Grenada not continue to develop because of this?
The 10%.
The opposition rebuttal speaker.
Opponent, good afternoon all. Opponent, you agree that an implementation is needed. If so, what is your argument? A land use policy is clearly needed, so why not fully implement it? Why put our future development at risk to partially implement one? Opponent, your team has clearly diverted from the moot. As my speaker stated, land is linked to everything. Our food, our water, everything, opponent. How can we educate our people if their schools are constantly flooding due to terrible placement? The Wesley College is constantly flooding, for example. Can students really learn in this environment? Your first speaker stated that development is linked to all aspects. She is also correct. How can you say we don't need a land policy when prime agricultural land is being used as residential developments? How do we ensure our food security when this is occurring? Perfection? Perfection? Who's aiming for perfection? We are aiming to continue to develop, which is synonymous to sustainable development. We have not developed to sustain our livelihood, which a land use policy can change and sustain our future. Opponents, how is it development when we have our sewage team leaking into the water where our fish is? How? How, opponents, can you say that a land use policy will not affect our development in 10 years? If our land is not regulated, we will not be this sustainably developing. This will be in contradiction with what we have signed on to with the United Nations. What will we have left to develop on? Development, it may not stop without a land use policy, but it will not be sustainable. In fact, it will eventually come to a standstill in which we have no land to build upon. Where will we put more schools, hospitals, and infrastructure? Not to mention, I thank you.
The proposition rebuttal speaker.
The valiant efforts of our opponents in defending what is clearly an indefensible case does not go unnoticed. Honorable judges, clearly our opponents have demonstrated that they have not fully grasped two key concepts in the moot: development and full implementation. As your first-hand speakers failed to give a definition of development, though it is important to note, no system is perfect. Your first speaker mentioned all the benefits of a land use policy. This we have absolutely no issues with. We agree that it is a valuable tool in promoting development. However, it is not the only tool. We have demonstrated just this. Development is much more than GDP or economic growth, and when that anything becomes more advanced or stronger in form outside the realms of a land use policy, clearly their reasoning is flawed. Your second speaker stated that there is a land degradation in Bellevue South. But, worthy opponents, are you aware of the road that is being built there as a mean for easier transportation? They also suggested that development done in a haphazard manner can severely deplete our natural resources, thereby preventing development. Opponents, does zoning, the very thing you implied, provide our young people with opportunities for empowerment? Opponents, keep up to the time. That is an antiquated model. Development, as I know you know, is both qualitative and quantitative. Honorable Chair, judges, this is our cup. Full implementation, partial implementation. Is this negligible difference enough to ground to a halt our country's development? I thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Please tune in for the rest of Season 10 of the Grenlec Debates and visit us on our Facebook page to vote for your favorite debater.
The Grenlec Debates. Vote for your favorite debater on our Facebook page. The Grenlec Debates. Powering bright ideas.